How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come with shout of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then I shall bow in humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Well, good evening to you. I have some really good news for most of you in this room. There may be a few of you that think oddly of this, but good news for the rest of you, and that is that we only have 3 more weeks for me to be teaching this class. We've got to get to the end of the book of Acts here pretty quickly, and then we've got VBS in about 4 weeks from tonight, and then we'll have another class coming in for a month or so after that. So we've got 3 more weeks, and we've got about 5 chapters to go through. So we'll see how much of that we can cover in these next few weeks. We'll do the best that we can. And tonight we're starting in Acts chapter 23. You might want to turn over there. If you haven't been in our class on Sunday nights, we've been discussing the book of Acts for a little while. And we're going kind of verse by verse, reading through the material and seeing what things that we can learn, what lessons that we can gather from the material. And we're going to continue doing that tonight. So before we begin, let's open with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for giving us another chance to come here tonight, to open your word, to learn from the mission work of Paul and the things that he went through, the struggles that he encountered, the people that he dealt with and talked to and tried to teach, the conversions that we read about in the book of Acts, the riots, the things that he had to face. And Father, thank you for his example, the things that he did, and the lessons that we can learn from his courage, his bravery, but also his humility, and the way that he loved you and was fully dedicated to you and to your kingdom. Father, as we open your word tonight, we pray that you would be with us and help us to study diligently and help us to think on these things. It's through your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we finished up in Acts chapter 23 last week. So we're going to start in verse 26. And if you'll remember, the commander that Paul was talking to in Acts chapter 23 was talking with him, and there was this plot that had formulated to take Paul's life. And if you look in chapter 23, verse 12, just to be reminded, when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And so this was a pretty bold plan that they formulated. They were going to end Paul's life. The things that they were accusing Paul of were simply untrue, right? That he defiled the temple. You remember that last week? We talked about that. They saw him walking in the streets with a Gentile, someone who wasn't a Jew, and so they just assumed that he had brought him into the temple, which there was no evidence of that. They accused him of going against the law of Moses, teaching things that simply were against the law, and none of that was true. And yet, town to town, when Paul went, they were following him, and now it's gotten really serious. But of course, we find out in verse 16 that Paul's sister's son heard of this plot, heard of their ambush, and he went and he told Paul, and Paul sent him to tell the commander what was going on, and he did. And then in verse 22, I think that's where we ended last week. The commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." So now we're going to see what the commander does regarding this plot and what he's going to do about Paul. So let's start reading in verse 23. And you'll see in just a moment why this map is there as our first slide. You'll see this journey that's they're about to undergo. So Acts chapter 23, verse 23. "And he called for 2 centurions, saying, Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. He wrote a letter in the following manner," verse 26, "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell." Verse 31, "Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and return to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from, and when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium." All right, so talk to me. What do you see in these verses? What jumps out to you? An awful lot of people to transport one person. How many were there? Okay. Did anybody do the math? How many? Somebody. 470 people. 470 people. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. Now, do you remember last week how many people were in this plot to kill Paul? You remember? It was more than 40, right? That's what it said. More than 40. So you're in this group of 40. You're laying in ambush. You're laying in wait for Paul. And all of a sudden, what do you see? 470 people. What are you going to do when you're in this group of 40? Split. Yeah. You're not going to, what are you going to do? 470 people against 40. You're probably going to rethink your plans at that moment. All right, so an awful lot of people to transport one person. What else? What else do you see? They did it by night. Yeah. It's almost like the commander wasn't a dumb person, was he? He knew what he was doing. Okay, so they did it by night. They snuck Paul out by night. Now, we don't know if that means the more than 40 didn't see it going on. We don't know that, but we know that it happened by night. Okay? What else? Okay? See the value of being a Roman citizen. And Victor, we've talked several weeks, we've seen Paul take advantage of that when he needed to, right? He certainly knew how to do that. Excellent point. The value of being a Roman citizen.
It's a characteristic of Roman leaders to wash their hands of the matter as quick as they can.
Yeah, it's an interesting, but he didn't just wash his hands of it either. He kind of, brown-nosed with the person above him, didn't he? Oh, most excellent this, you're the best that. Look what I did for you. I'm sending him to you. I saved him from the clutches, which was kind of true. I'm not saying that part wasn't true. but he certainly made a point to point it out, didn't he? Okay? Excellent point. Why do you think the commander would do this? We talked last week about this was kind of a risky move for Paul, right? To go tell the plot, have his sister's son go tell the plot to the commander. Paul didn't know what the commander was going to do, as far as we can tell. Why do you think the commander would do this? Would send him with all of this entourage to Caesarea? And by the way, you can see on the map there, that's the basic journey that they took. We saw about halfway through that some of the soldiers left and went back, and the rest went on and accompanied him up to Caesarea. But any ideas why the commander would do this?
Maybe it was him saying, hey, I rescued this Roman citizen. I'm going to take him back for a fair trial. I don't know.
Okay. Maybe he wanted him to have a fair trial. Because he was Roman. Back to what Victor was saying. It's possible. Maybe he was trying to get some brownie points with his superior. We don't really know. It's just speculation, but it's just things to think about why the commander would decide to do this.
Well, I think one of the issues that goes on at that time, you see the same thing with Pilate. They don't like there being strife going on in the streets, because then it looks like they're not maintaining their territory.
Mm-hmm.
Things are happening, unruly things are happening. And so to get it, send a message to the Jews that there's no way you're going to hurt this Roman citizen. And I'll show you kind of the thing, I think is as much of a pretense to send a message to the Jews as it is getting Paul out to get a fair trial.
Okay. So some crowd control, some political control of the area. I'm not going to allow this nonsense to go on in my area. And it seemed like everywhere Paul went, the same type of chaos was going, right? Not necessarily his fault, because the same Jews at times were following him from city to city, causing this chaos. So absolutely, I think all of those are certainly possible. Now, what do you think about when, at the end of that chapter, when they present Paul to Felix? I found it interesting in verse 35 that he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. I found that a pretty interesting, almost, and Mark, kind of back to what you're saying, almost a fair type of thing, right? I'm not going to hear your case unless the other side is also here to present their case. If you've ever been to court, that's what a judge is going to say. I'm not going to hear your side unless the other side is also here, or at least has the opportunity to be here. And if they didn't show up, they didn't show up, but I'm going to give them the opportunity to be here. I found that kind of an interesting, almost a due process type of thing. Let your accusers come. Now, they weren't there yet, but Felix was certainly interested, I think, to hear what they had to say. All right. So we see, of course, that the plot was foiled. When the commander found out, he did what he could to usher Paul out of there. Whatever his motivations were, he certainly did it. All right. Anything else there, the conclusion of that chapter? All right, then let's move on to chapter 24. Let's read the first 9 verses together. Now, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace, and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. All right. So now his accusers have come, right? And they get the first stab at this. So what do you see in these 9 verses? What pops out to you? This is the awkward moment where I can stand here for a while.
They compliment Felix a lot to me. Like that opening statement is very complimentary. Seems like try to get him on their side.
Yeah, absolutely. The first part of this speech to Felix is full of flowery words, isn't it? Full of compliments. Man, they are really buttering him up, aren't they? Really trying to get him on their side. It's almost overboard how many things that they say about how wonderful he is. So that's a great point. Definitely trying to get him on their side. What else?
I think he wanted to hear what they had to say because they sent Paul to him to be on trial. So I guess he wanted to see what the charges was against him and why they had maybe certain charges.
Okay. So Felix was really interested to hear what these charges were. What in the world were they doing? Why did they send him there? So he gave them the first opportunity. Tell me what he's accused of, right? Tell me why have you brought him here? What are we doing? Okay? Good? Anything else? Let's think for a minute about the things that they were charging him with. I find 4 charges in this very quick speech that Tertullus, the orator, by the way, the speaker, the one who is supposed to be full of, knowing what to say and how to say it. So what are the things? Give me the specifics. I can think of 4 things that he accuses, that Tertullus says the Jews are accusing Paul of. What's the first one? What's that? Look in verse 5. What's the first word? He's a plague, right? This man is a plague. Now, how would you feel if you're accused of being a plague? Not very good, right? You're just a plague, okay? That's number 1. What's number 2? I heard it over here. Say it again. Creator of dissension. All right, what's a dissension? Riots, right? Mark, that's what you were saying? Creator of dissension. A mover of insurrections, some versions may say. Someone who was clearly dangerous to the public. And it's true that there were riots wherever he went, right? We've been reading about them. He wasn't necessarily the creator of those, but that's their view. So we got a plague, we got a creator of dissensions. What's the third one? He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, right? A ringleader. He's the main guy. Now, what is the sect of the Nazarenes? What was that? We know it as, by another word, Christians. It was the way. That's what they were being known as. There were several different negative phrases that were applied to them, and this is one of them. He was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And what's number 4? Verse 6. Profaning the temple. So we've seen that before, right? We've seen that. Remember Trophimus a few chapters back? He was the Gentile that was supposedly taken into the temple. No evidence of it, but okay. And that was in chapter 21. Now, I want you to notice something about these accusations. How many actual facts do they state against Paul? They call him a plague. Okay, based on what? When you go to court, you got to have facts. You can't just go in and say, well, we don't like him. The judge is going to say, well, okay, what's your point? Dismissed. Okay? They call him a plague. Not much fact there. They call him a creator of dissension. But they don't say when, where, how. Nothing. No facts. It's just opinion. He's a creator of dissension. What do you do if you're a judge with that? Can't do much. There's no evidence. Got to have evidence. They really didn't have much. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now let's stop there for just a second. That was actually true, right? He was a leader of the Christians. I don't think that one would have bothered him that much. But it's also not a crime. It's not a crime. That one might be fact-based, no crime. Okay? And then finally, that he profaned the temple. Now, there's an actual fact that they're stating. Now, it's incorrect, but it's at least a statement of a fact, right? But what I want you to see is that for the most part, their accusations against Paul were nothing but opinion. No evidence of anything. Just, we don't like this man. We don't like him. You're going to see in just a moment how Paul approaches those things a little bit differently in his defense. All right, but those are the things that they accuse him of. 4 separate charges. He's a plague, a pestilent fellow. He's a creator of dissension, a ringleader of the Nazarenes, the sect of the Nazarenes, and he profaned the temple. And those accusations are just insults, no fact.
You notice when they started it, though, they really started, of course, with buttering them up and just saying, hey, you've provided such peace for this whole region. And everything on there that they said after that was just the opposite of the peace. And I think that was just trying to build their case.
You know, that's a good point. That's what Mark is saying is when they first started, when Tertullus first started this speech, he was full of flattery, right? And one of the flattering things they said was, you have provided us such tranquility, such peace, right? But look at Paul. He's going completely against all of that. So, Mark, you may be onto something. They may have been trying to compare, the things that they're claiming Felix brought to them, and that Paul is destroying all of that. He's tearing it all down. It's a good point. Hadn't thought of it that way. Okay? Anything else? Dan.
It's important for us to see that Paul had a reputation in this passage. And his reputation was cemented to his connection to Jesus Christ. First of all, they said, this guy is the ringleader of the people that are following this Nazarene Jesus. He was known as a leader for Jesus. Second, he was known as stirring up people. It does say, among all the Jews throughout the world. So he was known as someone closely connected to Jesus everywhere he went. And he was known as a virus as a result, COVID-19. Everywhere he goes, he's spreading his influence for Jesus. So once again, you could not separate Jesus from the Apostle Paul, and it begs the question, do I have a reputation like that? Do people think of Jesus when they think of me, as they thought of Jesus when they thought of Paul?
Yeah, it was completely inseparable in their minds. I think that's right. And this was before the days of social media. Imagine how many Instagram followers he would have had, right? He didn't have that, and yet everybody knew who he was. His reputation preceded him, which is amazing when you think about they had no mass communication of any kind, really. He was sending letters, and who knows how long it took for them to reach their desired location. And yet, everywhere he went, people knew him. His reputation was locked in place by this point. Absolutely. Now, in some ways, he certainly didn't run from that. If someone had accused him of being inseparable from Christ, what would he have said? Absolutely. Thank you, right? You can imagine he would have accepted that label in a heartbeat. In fact, he tried to apply that to himself, and he wanted others to do the same thing. All right. So let's see how Paul reacts to this. We've read in the last few weeks, we've read several defenses, several apologetics or apologia that Paul has already done. First, to the Jews in general, right? He did that. Then to the commander and the Sanhedrin council. Now we're going to see him make this defense to Felix. Let's read starting in verse 10. And we're going to read through verse 21. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd." Oh, in fact, I want you to hang on to that thought for just one second. There was one other thing I wanted to point out in the previous section. Look in verse 7, and I'm sorry to break the thought here, but look in verse 7. The Tertullus and the crowd are telling Felix that Lysias, the commander, came by and with great violence took him out of our hands. You see that in verse 7? What was the violence that was taking place in the previous chapter? Do you remember why Lysias took him into the barracks? Because he was afraid they were tearing him to pieces, right? Who was the violence? Who was committing the violence? The crowds. Paul wasn't. And yet they say to Felix that it was Lysias that was acting violently. Did you notice that? That was just something else that really struck me as I was preparing this, that their evidence, their statement towards him wasn't, not only was it not fact-based, but it was actually dishonest. They left out some pretty important pieces of information. All right, so I'm sorry, I just wanted to point that out. Verse 13, "Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now after many years I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been here before you to object, if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day." All right, so there's Paul's defense to these 4 charges. And really, their charges are not limited to those 4 things. They're simply accusing Paul of being ungodly, of being a dissenter, just in his entire life. So, all right, so what do you see in his defense? Talk to me about how he's defending himself here. Yes, sir.
Some sect somewhere embracing the teachings of Christ.
Yeah, he's certainly saying, I'm not part of a cult. right? I'm not part of, some backward type of thinking. But it's interesting, of the 4 charges, he separates the charges too immediately, doesn't he? He pulls one of them out and said, yes, I am a follower of God. And if you call that a sect, that's on you. I am a leader of the way of the Christians. Absolutely. So he admitted to that one. The way. Mm-hmm. Yep. So he admitted that it was the way. That's what it was called at the time, and that he had no problem with that. All right? What else?
The other 3 charges, he actually told what he done.
For the other 3 charges, he actually said what he had done. Yeah, and let Felix decide, is that really being a dissenter? Is that really a plague? Am I really rioting by speaking about my faith? I don't think so. Okay? What else? Did you notice a difference between, or a contrast between the accusations and Paul's defense? The accusations had no fact to them, right? They were simply opinion, no evidence at all. Paul's actually presenting facts in his defense. When you're a judge, you've got to rely on facts that are presented to you, actual evidence, not simply statements of opinion. You want to hear from actual eyewitnesses. You've heard the phrase hearsay, right? You don't want to hear it from someone who heard it from someone else, who heard it from somebody else. You want to hear it from someone who was there. Even eyewitnesses can be wrong, of course. But an eyewitness is a lot more credible than someone who told their friend and now comes to court. Well, no, a judge doesn't want to put up with that. It's not going to put up with that. That's all they were doing. But Paul was presenting actual fact of what he had done, who he had been. Okay, what else? Something I found interesting in verse 16, where Paul says, again, that he strives to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Have you heard him talk about having a clear conscience before? We talked about it last week. What happened when he said he had a clear conscience, a good conscience? Do you remember? Dale? He got slapped. Well, again, I'm not sure if he actually got slapped or if he just got threatened to be slapped, right? The beginning of chapter 23. And here, we don't see any evidence of him about to be slapped here. But, Paul was taking he was pretty bold. But he repeated that he was doing things in a good conscience, a clear conscience. And so we've talked about that several times. Verse 19 also jumped out to me. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Paul is not simply defending the facts of the situation. He's not simply disproving the lack of evidence, really, but he's not just disproving what evidence they had presented. He's also challenging the legal process that they followed. That's a whole separate area of the law. You can get cases thrown out of court simply because the process was incorrect, having absolutely nothing to do with the merits of the case. Paul is saying, look, not only are the facts wrong, the procedure is wrong. If they really had something to accuse me of, verse 19, they should have presented it to you. But they didn't. They didn't. And
You have to go back to the previous scriptures where before they brought their case, they flattered the judge. And if you build someone up enough, then when the truth comes out, you've made them feel so good, it's hard for them to go against you. So they built their case starting out with flattery and a lie.
Yeah, they started to build their case with flattery and a lie. And I can't help but think the reason that they did that, beyond the simple, the obvious of just trying to butter up the judge, They didn't have anything else. They didn't have anything else. So what could they rely on but making him feel good, making him like them? You know, if you've got a judge that you can build up to such an extent that he's going to rule in your favor regardless of the facts, that's a judge that should recuse himself from the case, right? But that's what they were trying to do. It's a great point, great point. But here in verse 19, Paul is it's almost like his defense is two-pronged. The first prong is the facts are incorrect. Well, first, they haven't stated any, but even if they did, it's false. So it should be dismissed based on the merits, but then it should also be dismissed based on the process. And I think Paul was right by saying that. So the only true charge that they brought, in fact, Paul says this towards the end of that, in verse 21, the only true charge that he said that they could have brought is that statement he made concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. So at the end of the day, the only thing that he's saying they might have had a problem with or could have had a problem with is that he spoke about the resurrection. They didn't like that. They didn't like that. That's not a crime. It wasn't a crime. Certainly under Roman law. That's why they kept shipping him to this person and that person. Well, we can't find anything against him that's worthy of prison or death or those sorts of things. He wasn't committing any crime. And in fact, they didn't even raise that with Felix. That wasn't part of Tertullus' speech to Felix. Anything about the resurrection of the dead. But do you remember why he did that in the previous chapter? Do you remember why he started talking about the resurrection? Why was it? Say again? Yeah. To get the Pharisees and the Sadducees to fight with each other. And it was so smart because now all of a sudden the Pharisees are defending him at that point, right? Oh, he's done nothing wrong. He's such a great guy. Because they agreed with him. But they didn't mention this to Felix. A lot of details that they decided to leave out. I'm sure it was on accident, right? They just forgot these details. No, of course. All right. So, let's move to the next part of chapter 24. Let's read verses 22 through 27. So now we've got Tertullus has given the accusations. He's given the charges. He's levied the charges, Chris, so he's put all that in front of him. Now Paul has given his defense, said this is all a bunch of nonsense. So now let's see how Felix, who's the judge in this situation, is going to handle this. Verse 22, when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. All right. So, talk to me about Felix's response here. What's Felix do? Greg. Mm-hmm.
He said, this woman is not your wife. It's not lawful for you to have this woman.
Yeah, so Greg is pointing out that in verse 25, when Felix was afraid, he was afraid because Paul was teaching him about righteousness, self-control, and here Felix was in an unlawful marriage, right? And didn't like it. He didn't like that at all. He became afraid. So, excellent point, Greg. All right, what else? Dan.
I think it's interesting that in this chapter, which tells us that there was a specific identity and a specific group of people recognized as the followers of Jesus. And if we could pull back the layer of time a bit and bring it into our day, we live in a very woke culture, as it's called, because it's been created by a pluralistic society that says anything goes.
Mm-hmm.
Your belief system okay, my belief system okay. But when you listen to the teachings of Paul, who had a reputation as one professing Jesus Christ, things became very small.
Yeah.
God's people were those that followed only Jesus. And this is a message for us, even today. It's not anything goes. It's what he says that goes. And I also find it interesting that in his preaching, he references the fact that you can point to one thing that's true. I've been preaching about the resurrection.
Right.
And of course, in 1 Corinthians 15, he could preach about the resurrection of the dead because he was preaching about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
His preaching was a message that gave people hope. And they wanted that hope, even to the point they left everything, their families, their identities, their previous religions, and became part of this unique, inclusive group of people. You don't have to compromise the truth for God's church to excel. That's a great example of it right there.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in a small little town in West Texas, and we had a weekly newspaper that would come out. And when you read through that newspaper, there was always a little advertisement, a little block that had the different churches in town. And it always had a phrase at the beginning of that advertisement. You've seen it before. And it said, "Attend the church of your choice this week." You ever remember, any of you see that in your newspapers growing up? Okay. Some of you have. And Dan, what you're just saying reminded me of that. That always made me wonder, is that all this is? It's just whatever you choose, wherever you think? Or is there an actual truth that we can pursue? If you choose. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Just meet God on your own terms.
Right. That's
Way does not allow for
That's right. There's one way, and that's only through Christ. Only one way. And so we have to remember that today, just like they did then, just like they needed to learn it then. Excellent. You'll also hear in these verses that we read one of the very famous line from a song that you, I promise, have sang hundreds of times. Did you see that in verse 25? When Felix, he's been having these conversations with Paul, he's afraid, and what does he say? He says, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you," right? "Some more convenient day on thee I'll call," almost persuaded. One of the most, a very famous lyric that we have in this verse. And it's really a sad verse. You never know when that convenient time's going to come. Chuck was talking about that this morning. There is no more convenient time. The baptistry is here. The water is warm, even if it's cold. I remember when Mary was baptized not too long ago, the first thing she did when she stepped in the water, her face, "Whoa, it's cold." Okay, it's cold. Guess what? You're going under it, because she chose to do that, and she'll never forget it. But Chuck was talking about that this morning. There's no better time than right now. Felix didn't get that. He didn't understand it. But you also notice, of course, that Felix was willing to have all these conversations with Paul for what reason? Money. He wanted to be bribed. He wanted to be bribed. He wanted to be paid to let him go. Now, what kind of judge would do that? I mean, he was more than just a judge, of course, but in Paul's case, he was the judge. And, you do read about judges even today that get caught doing that kind of nonsense. It's rare, but it happens. Judges they're just human. And, of course, there's going to be some that are dishonest, just like in any other profession. But Felix was just hoping to be paid off. apparently Paul didn't have any money, Mark. I don't know, or he wasn't willing to give it up for Felix. But, okay, so we see that Paul, and this will be our last one, but we see that Paul spent 2 years in prison there in Caesarea because Felix wanted to be paid. He didn't, he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. And then we have his famous phrase, some more convenient day on thee I'll call, and then he gets succeeded by this man named Festus. And we're going to read a little bit about Festus and how Festus deals with Paul in our next class next week. So thank you very much.